I never thought a quiet morning on my farm could turn into a nightmare. Out of nowhere, a group of strangers appeared at my gate, bold and angry, demanding I submit to the HOA's ridiculous rules. They didn't know who they were dealing with. My loyal K9 Rex growled at the edge of the driveway, ears perked and teeth bared while my shotgun rested within arm's reach, loaded and ready. Just when I thought the tension couldn't get any worse, flashing lights appeared at the end of the driveway. The sheriff had arrived. I froze for a moment, unsure if this would end peacefully or erupt into chaos. What would you do if they came for your home? The sun had just started to climb over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the rolling fields of my family's farm. For generations, we had worked this land, tending to the crops and livestock, keeping traditions alive, and enjoying the quiet life that so many people dreamed about but few truly understood. My mornings always began with the same ritual. Coffee in hand, I'd walk along the fence line to check on Rex, my loyal K9, who never left my side. The rooster's crow, the gentle lowing of the cattle, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze created a sense of calm that felt unshakable. Neighbors were few and far between, and for the most part, life was peaceful. Friendly waves from passing drivers and the occasional neighborly chat at the mailbox made the community feel small but welcoming. I prided myself on maintaining the property, keeping everything tidy but natural, letting the land breathe the way it had for over a century. Yet beneath this serene routine, there was a tension that I had ignored, or perhaps didn't see coming. The HOA in our area was notorious, at least according to the few people who had ever interacted with it. Letters arrived occasionally, subtle at first, reminders about property lines, landscaping guidelines, or minor infractions that seemed harmless. I brushed them off, thinking, we've done nothing wrong. We respect our land, and we respect the law. But one afternoon, a notice landed on the front porch that would change everything. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a demand, written in rigid, legalistic language that hinted at fines, penalties, and an expectation to join an organization I had never wanted to be part of. That day, as I read the letter under the shade of the old oak tree, a pit grew in my stomach. The rules they were enforcing seemed arbitrary, bordering on absurd, and there was no room for negotiation. I glanced around at my property, my home, my sanctuary, and realized that what had once been peaceful could now become a battlefield. The HOA wasn't just a background annoyance anymore. It was an active threat. It started subtly, small demands that felt invasive, neighbors making offhand comments about following the rules, and an unsettling sense that someone was watching every move. At first, I tried to rationalize it. They may be concerned citizens, or it could be a misunderstanding. But the feeling of intrusion kept growing, like a shadow creeping across the property lines. Every day brought a new letter, a new warning, or a conversation laced with thinly veiled threats. Meanwhile, life continued on the farm. Rex patrolled the yard, ever vigilant, and the crops grew, resilient and strong despite the looming tension. Family routines carried on, tending to the animals, checking equipment, and sharing meals on the porch as the sun dipped low in the sky. Yet the tranquility was now punctuated by the anxiety of what might come next. Every knock on the door or unexpected vehicle on the road made my heart race. Looking back, it was in those quiet moments, watching the wind ripple through the fields, and feeling the weight of the upcoming confrontation, that I realized how much was at stake. This land wasn't just property, it was heritage, security, and the culmination of generations of hard work. And I knew deep down that the confrontation with the HOA and particular neighbors was inevitable. Something had been triggered, a spark that once lit would set the stage for a battle neither I nor they could have fully anticipated. By the time the first official visit from the HOA representatives arrived, tensions had built silently but steadily. Their arrival wasn't dramatic at first, just a car parked neatly by the mailbox, two suited individuals stepping out with clipboards and polite smiles. But there was an underlying rigidity to their posture, a sense of authority that carried an unspoken warning. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something in the air shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, signaling that the peaceful days were numbered. That evening, as I closed the barn doors and looked across the property, I felt a mixture of pride and unease. The land felt like mine, yet I could sense the looming presence of rules, fines, and interference threatening to strip away that ownership in the most absurd of ways. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the fields in shades of fire and shadow, I knew that the calm before the storm was ending. The following steps I would take, small choices, measured responses, would soon escalate into a conflict that none of us could ignore, a test of resolve, loyalty, and how far someone would go to protect what was theirs. Every morning after that felt different. The wind no longer seemed gentle. It carried whispers of confrontation. Each knock on the door made my pulse quicken. And yet, amidst the anxiety, a quiet determination grew. I wasn't about to back down. This was my land, my home, and my life. And no arbitrary rules or overreaching neighbors would take that away without a fight. Little did I know, the first confrontation, the one that would push everything to the edge, was only days away, and it would be far more intense than anything I had imagined. The days following the initial HOA notice were a blur of anxiety and minor confrontations that slowly chipped away at my sense of normalcy. Letters arrived almost daily, each one carefully worded to make me feel smaller, more accountable, more wrong. One letter claimed that my fence was non-compliant, though it had stood for decades without issue. Another insisted that the grass on the northern pasture was too tall, according to some obscure rule buried deep in a 200-page HOA handbook that I had never agreed to. Each notice came with fines, escalating in both amount and severity, threatening, liens against my property. The harassment wasn't loud at first. It was subtle, bureaucratic, but the weight of it grew heavier with every passing day. Neighbors who had once greeted me warmly began to act differently, too. There were whispers as I tended to the crops, sidelong glances when Rex barked at unfamiliar vehicles passing the driveway, and even passive-aggressive notes slipped under the door, reminders to follow the rules or complaints about my non-compliant landscaping. At first, I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself that these people had little power beyond annoyance. But then came the first in-person confrontation, and everything changed. A mid-morning visit from the HOA's so-called compliance officer caught me off guard. The man was sharply dressed, clipboard in hand, with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He began reciting rules, restrictions, and expectations, as if reading from a script designed to intimidate. Your livestock pen isn't aligned with Section 4, Paragraph 17 of our community code, he said, glancing around with feigned judgment. I tried to respond logically, explaining that the pen had been in place for years, that none of my neighbors had ever complained, and that the property lines had been surveyed legally. He didn't budge. Every point I made was countered with references to obscure clauses, each more absurd than the last. It was clear that the goal wasn't to resolve an issue. It was to assert dominance, to make me feel powerless in my own home. That afternoon, as I walked through the barn, I noticed a small group of men lingering near the property line, wearing dark jackets and sunglasses. At first, I assumed they were passing through, but their presence became impossible to ignore. They circled the edge of my farm, taking notes, snapping pictures, and occasionally glancing directly at me with an unsettling focus. I called the local sheriff's office to report the unusual activity. While they assured me someone would keep an eye out, the sense of vulnerability didn't leave. Rex stayed close, growling softly, his ears twitching at every sound beyond the fence. That night, I could hardly sleep, imagining worst-case scenarios and mentally preparing for the possibility that the intimidation could escalate. The following week brought the first real shock, a notice of fines for unauthorized alterations to my driveway. According to the HOA, the gravel I had added to smooth out ruts violated the community's aesthetic standards. I stared at the notice in disbelief. This was my land. Every decision I made was practical, safe, and in keeping with tradition. Yet suddenly, every move was scrutinized, criticized, and monetarily penalized. I began documenting everything: photos of the property, notes about every interaction, timestamps for each letter. It wasn't just about the fines, it was about protecting myself from an organization that seemed determined to make me feel helpless. Then came the neighbor complaints. Out of nowhere, a letter arrived alleging that Rex's barking was excessive and disruptive to the peace of the community. I had raised Rex since he was a puppy, training him meticulously, and the occasional bark was a natural part of farm life. Still, the HOA demanded action, threatening additional fines if I didn't address the disturbance immediately. I felt a mix of rage and disbelief. My loyal companion, who had protected my family for years, was now being used as leverage against me. Tension escalated further during an unseasonably hot afternoon. A delivery truck accidentally drove too close to the property line, and a neighbor immediately reported it to the HOA as a potential trespass violation. Suddenly, my property was under constant surveillance, and I began noticing strangers driving slowly past the driveway, peering in, or even attempting to take pictures from the edges of the road. Each incident, no matter how trivial, was twisted into a justification for fines, warnings, or threats of legal action. It became clear that this wasn't about community standards. It was a targeted campaign to assert control. My frustration reached a boiling point when an official inspection team arrived unannounced, entering my property without invitation. They measured fences, counted livestock, and documented minor details with meticulous attention, each note intended to be evidence against me. I confronted them, politely yet firmly asking them to leave, citing property rights, but they refused to acknowledge my authority. That day, Rex stayed close, growling low, and I made a silent promise that I would not back down. I could feel the situation teetering on the edge. Every unfair letter, every petty complaint, every unwanted visit was building toward a confrontation I could no longer avoid. The subsequent escalation came in the form of a legal notice. The HOA claimed I had violated multiple rules simultaneously, demanding not only payment of fines, but also threatening liens against my home and farm. My heart sank. I wasn't a wealthy person looking to skirt rules. I was someone trying to protect a family legacy. But the sheer audacity of their demands made it clear this was no longer a casual dispute. The HOA was weaponizing bureaucracy and fear, hoping I would buckle under pressure. The first few encounters with their representatives had been unsettling, but nothing prepared me for what came next. One morning, as I tended to the pasture, a group of men arrived in a large, unmarked van. They weren't the usual HOA officers. They looked like hired enforcers, strangers whose intent was clearly intimidation. My pulse quickened. The van stopped near the driveway, and the men stepped out, scanning the land with an air of arrogance. My mind raced. I had to protect my property, my family, and my sense of justice. It was at this moment that the full gravity of the situation hit me. They thought fear alone would make me comply, but they had no idea what I was willing to do to defend my home. Rex sensed the tension instantly, circling my feet and growling low, his body tense. I gripped the shotgun I kept near the barn, not with anger, but with a sense of preparedness. Every instinct screamed caution. Every lesson from the past years of farm life warned me that confrontation was inevitable. And yet, I felt a strange clarity. For too long, I had tolerated letters, complaints, and petty interference. Now it was no longer about rules or fines. It was about principle, about standing firm in the face of intimidation. I watched as the men approached the gate, their steps slow but deliberate. One raised his hand as if to knock, but hesitation flickered in his expression. Maybe they sensed the same warning I felt radiating from Rex. Perhaps it was the shotgun glinting in the morning sun. Or perhaps they were underestimating me entirely. Regardless, the moment was tense, like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. I had one chance to show that compliance would not be forced, that fear would not dictate the outcome. The first part of the rising action ends here, but the tension has only begun. Each subsequent interaction would escalate the stakes further, push limits, and force me to make decisions that could change everything. With fines mounting, legal threats looming, and intimidation escalating into confrontation, the stage was set for a showdown no one would forget. The days following the arrival of the unmarked van were a constant battle of nerves, strategy, and patience. Each morning I would step outside, assessing the perimeter, scanning the horizon, and noting any unusual movements from neighbors or strangers. The HOA's harassment had grown from letters to physical presence, unrelenting and deeply invasive. Every interaction became a test of resolve, and I quickly realized that staying passive would only embolden them further. One afternoon, a particularly aggressive representative arrived, waving a thick folder of citations and fines. He claimed that several items in my barn were unauthorized structures, despite their obvious function for the property. I tried to reason with him, calmly explaining the necessity of each installation, but he wasn't listening. His goal was clear: to make me flinch, to assert control, and to break my will. I could feel my temper rise, but I kept my composure, reminding myself that a reaction without strategy would only play into their hands. Meanwhile, the letters kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. Complaints about the placement of trash bins, the color of my mailbox, and even the way I trimmed my hedges were cited as violations. Every day, I cataloged the incidents, creating a paper trail that I hoped would protect me if legal action became unavoidable. The frustration was suffocating, a mix of anger, disbelief, and determination. It was hard to sleep, hard to focus on daily tasks, and nearly impossible to ignore the feeling that someone, or several people, were constantly watching. Then came a night that would forever change the dynamic. I heard the crunch of tires approaching in the darkness, and Rex barked sharply, alerting me immediately. Flashlights cut across the yard, and I realized that a small group had returned, this time under the cover of night, attempting to intimidate, rather than negotiate. I stayed calm, quietly ensuring the shotgun was loaded and within reach. At the same time, Rex patrolled the perimeter with a silent ferocity. The men lingered, scanning the property, seemingly unaware that their audacity had just crossed a line. My pulse raced as I considered my next move, knowing that any misstep could escalate the situation beyond control. By morning, word had spread that the farm was no longer an easy target. The HOA's threats continued, but the unspoken tension in the air had shifted. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far I would let them push before pushing back, and go they did. A series of fines arrived, bundled with letters suggesting immediate legal action. Some even hinted at enlisting local authorities to enforce compliance. I knew they were leveraging fear, but fear had its limits, and I refused to let it dictate my actions. The next confrontation was almost cinematic in its absurdity. The HOA representatives arrived during a light rain, clipboards in hand, measuring the exact distance between fence posts, scrutinizing the angles of my driveway, and inspecting every inch of visible property. It was surreal, like a scene from a film where bureaucracy became weaponized. I watched silently, speaking only when necessary, ensuring that every word, every gesture, and every interaction was documented. The tension between compliance and defiance was palpable, and I realized that this constant pressure was designed to erode my confidence, make me question my own judgment, and force surrender. At this point, the stakes escalated beyond fines and threats. The local community, once quiet observers, began to weigh in. Conversations that had once been pleasant now carried judgment or suspicion. Notes appeared in mailboxes warning of future consequences if I didn't conform. The world I had known, simple, predictable, and peaceful, was now overrun with scrutiny, interference, and petty power plays. Every interaction became a test. Would I bend or would I stand firm? One afternoon, I decided to take proactive measures. I reviewed every letter, every complaint, and every citation. I documented the discrepancies, highlighting the absurdity and unfairness. I photographed every part of the property mentioned in the letters, and I double-checked local regulations to ensure I had a legal footing. Preparation became my armor, but the anxiety remained. I knew that each day brought new challenges. Each moment could be a flashpoint, and that patience alone would not be enough. Then, the most unnerving escalation occurred. A small group of men, clearly not HOA members but hired to enforce compliance, attempted to enter the property once again. This time, their intentions were unmistakable. I stepped outside, shotgun in hand, while Rex positioned himself protectively at my side. The men hesitated, casting glances at each other, seemingly unsure whether to proceed. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stood firm, signaling that this property was not to be crossed lightly. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching, unbearably as I weighed the risk of confrontation against the imperative to protect my home. The HOA continued to escalate in every conceivable way. More letters, more fines, more attempts at intimidation. Yet, through it all, my resolve hardened. Each attempt to bully or manipulate only reinforced the truth that I would not be driven from my home or submit to their arbitrary rules. The situation had grown far beyond a simple dispute. It was now a test of endurance, courage, and strategic thinking. As the second part of the rising action concludes, the narrative tension is at its peak. The HOA's harassment has reached its most aggressive, direct, and threatening phase. Physical presence, legal threats, fines, and intimidation tactics all converge to create a high-stakes scenario. And yet, the homeowner's determination, combined with careful preparation and unwavering loyalty from Rex, sets the stage for an inevitable confrontation, one that promises dramatic escalation, shocking twists, and the potential for justice in the most unexpected forms. The tension had been building for weeks, each day layering more anxiety, more scrutiny, and more blatant intimidation. By the morning of the confrontation, the air felt heavy, almost electric, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I knew something was coming. The HOA had grown bolder with each letter, each unannounced visit, and each petty threat. Their demands had escalated from fines and notices to physical presence on the property, testing the limits of my patience and resolve. Today, I realized, would be the culmination of every minor clash, every letter, every whisper behind my back. It started innocuously enough. A knock on the gate, firm and deliberate, followed by the distinct sound of boots crunching over gravel. I peered through the window and saw 3 men, suited. Still with the cold edge of authority, clipboard in hand, accompanied by the faint glint of an unfamiliar SUV parked just beyond the property line. These weren't ordinary HOA officers. Their demeanor was aggressive, almost predatory, and it became immediately apparent that they intended to intimidate rather than negotiate. I could feel my pulse quicken, adrenaline surging as I prepared myself mentally and physically. Rex, ever vigilant, growled low in the background, his hackles raised, sensing the same danger I felt. My hand rested lightly on the shotgun near the barn door, not out of anger, but in readiness, a symbol of resolve and protection. The men approached the gate, papers in hand, their eyes scanning the property as if trying to assert dominance without speaking a word. I opened the door cautiously, facing them with calm determination. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady but firm. "What brings you here today?" The tallest man smirked, glancing down at his clipboard. "We're here to ensure compliance with the HOA regulations," he said. His tone was condescending, each word dripping with the expectation that I would immediately acquiesce. "There are several violations, and we expect immediate corrections." I studied him carefully, noting the arrogance. In his posture, the assumption that fear would be sufficient to bend me. "Violations?" I repeated, my voice measured. "Please specify which violations you mean. I have every detail documented and am ready to discuss them, but I will not be intimidated." The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure, pointing toward the northern pasture. "Your fencing, your structures, the placement of your animals, all of it. It's non-compliant." I took a deep breath, glancing at Rex, who remained tense and alert. "Everything you see has been here for decades, all legal and properly documented. I respect the law, but I will not submit to arbitrary rules designed to harass me." For a moment, the air was charged with a silence so thick it felt like it could snap. Then, without warning, one of the men stepped forward, attempting to cross the property line. Rex lunged, teeth bared, growling fiercely. The man froze, taken aback by the sudden aggression. I lifted the shotgun, not to threaten, but to assert control. The morning sun glinted off the barrel, a clear message that the boundaries of my property were not to be crossed. "Step back," I said firmly, voice unwavering. "You do not have permission to enter." The tallest man hesitated, shifting nervously. He clearly hadn't anticipated resistance of this nature, let alone the presence of a trained canine and a homeowner unafraid to defend his land. A tense moment stretched, each second a test of nerve. Then, unexpectedly, the distant sound of sirens cut through the silence, a rapid wail that made the men flinch. Within minutes, sheriff's vehicles appeared, lights flashing, cutting through the tension like a knife. Officers stepped out, authoritative and calm, moving quickly toward the gate. The men from the HOA froze, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond their control. They shuffled their feet, muttering under their breath, suddenly aware that they were no longer the enforcers. They were now the ones being scrutinized. I explained the situation to the sheriff, detailing the harassment, the unannounced visits, and the threats of fines and intimidation. Every word was precise, calm, and factual. The officers listened carefully, asking pointed questions, taking notes, and documenting everything for the record. The HOA representatives tried to interject, to defend their actions. Still, their attempts sounded hollow and rehearsed against the weight of truth and evidence. Rex remained vigilant, moving between me and the visitors, a silent guardian ensuring that the property remained secure. The tension shifted slowly but unmistakably from intimidation to accountability. The men's confident postures crumbled, replaced by hesitation, unease, and visible discomfort. For the first time in weeks, I felt the balance of power tilt in my favor. The sheriff made it clear, any attempt to enforce arbitrary fines, harass the homeowner, or enter the property without permission would be met with legal consequences. The words landed like thunderclaps, reverberating across the farm and into the hearts of those who had assumed authority over a place they had no right to command. The HOA men exchanged glances, their smirks gone, replaced by the realization that their plan had unraveled in an instant. What followed was surreal. They attempted to continue their inspection, but every movement was cautious, measured, hesitant. It became clear that the threat they had posed so aggressively in letters and unannounced visits had lost its teeth. Their power relied entirely on fear, and once confronted with legal authority and unwavering resolve, it crumbled. Each attempt at intimidation was met with documentation, witness accounts, and the presence of law enforcement. The dynamic had shifted completely. I stood silently, watching as their confidence disintegrated. Months of harassment, sleepless nights, and mounting fines had led to this moment, the culmination of preparation, patience, and steadfast defense. I had faced the peak of their abuse of power, and by holding my ground, I had forced accountability in an undeniable way. Every threat, every fine, every petty complaint had been neutralized not through anger, but through strategy, evidence, and unwavering determination. Even as the HOA men left, shoulders slumped and faces pale, a part of me remained alert. The battle was won, but the consequences and lessons were lasting. The farm, my home, and my family had endured a gauntlet of harassment, and the validation of authority in our favor marked a turning point that no letter, visit, or fine could erase. And yet, in the quiet that followed as Rex padded beside me and the sheriff's vehicles receded down the driveway, a thought lingered, heavy and unspoken. Victory in confrontation was only part of the story. What remained to be seen was how the HOA would recover from this humiliation, how neighbors would react, and whether the piece of the land I had fought to protect could truly be restored. The climax had arrived, the power dynamic reversed, and the homeowner had emerged from the storm stronger, wiser, and unbowed. But the story was far from over. The seeds of retaliation, scrutiny, and community attention had been sown, leaving a lingering question that would follow long after the morning sun rose over the fields. Could they truly accept defeat, or was this only the beginning of a more intense and public showdown? The tension that had gripped the farm for weeks slowly began to ease. Still, the aftermath of the confrontation lingered in every corner of the property. The sheriff's presence that morning had been decisive, but the real impact went far beyond that single encounter. With the HOA representatives gone, their arrogance deflated and their threats neutralized. I finally had the space to breathe and reflect on everything that had transpired. The storm had passed, yet the echoes of it, the fines, the intimidation, the nights spent awake listening for footsteps or tires on gravel, remained vivid. The first days after the confrontation were cautious, yet deliberate. I walked the property slowly, noting the fences, the pastures, the barn, and the crops that had been my companions through every stage of this ordeal. Everything seemed more precious now, imbued with the weight of what had almost been lost. Rex padded beside me, his presence a comforting reminder that protection had been constant, loyal, and unwavering. It wasn't just about defending land, it had become about safeguarding a way of life, a family legacy, and a sense of dignity that no arbitrary authority could strip away. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors, who had previously been passive observers or quietly aligned with the HOA's complaints, now approached with caution and, in some cases, admiration. They had witnessed or heard accounts of how the situation had been handled, firmly, legally, and with a level of preparedness that made the previous intimidation attempts seem almost farcical. Conversations shifted subtly. Glances no longer carried judgment, but in some cases respect. The community, once a background to petty rules and whispered complaints, had now become aware that the dynamics of power could be challenged and overturned when approached with courage and strategy. The HOA, meanwhile, faced its own reckoning. Their tactics had been laid bare, not just to me, but to local authorities and, indirectly, to the community at large. Letters, fines, and arbitrary rules that had once been tools of control now appeared as evidence of overreach, overconfidence, and incompetence. A few board members attempted damage control, sending carefully worded apologies and vague promises of policy reviews. Still, the credibility they once wielded was irreparably damaged. Their reputation as enforcers of order had crumbled into a cautionary tale of how power can be misused when authority is assumed without accountability. The legal documentation I had maintained throughout the ordeal proved invaluable. Every letter, every photograph, every interaction, and every note was organized meticulously, creating a clear record of harassment, intimidation, and overreach. This archive not only protected me from future unjust claims, but also established a framework that others in the community could reference when dealing with similar disputes. By approaching the situation methodically, I had transformed a series of attacks into an unassailable defense, demonstrating that patience, preparation, and persistence could triumph over arbitrary power. Life on the farm began to settle into a renewed rhythm, but with a heightened sense of vigilance and awareness. I was no longer complacent about minor infringements or subtle threats. Every notice, every conversation, and every visit was met with careful attention. Yet, the fear and frustration that had dominated the past weeks were replaced by confidence and resilience. I had learned that authority could be questioned, intimidation could be resisted, and that standing firm did not mean isolation. It meant protecting what mattered most with clarity and purpose. Rex continued to be a constant presence, a symbol of loyalty and protection. His training, which had seemed routine and practical before, now took on a more profound significance. It wasn't just about guarding property. It was about signaling to anyone who might consider crossing boundaries that respect for others' rights was non-negotiable. The partnership between homeowner and K9 had been tested under extreme circumstances, and the bond had only strengthened through shared vigilance and mutual trust. The broader implications of the conflict became clear as time passed. The neighborhood, once a quiet backdrop to daily life, had transformed into a community more aware of its rights and responsibilities. Conversations among neighbors shifted, from passive complaint to active engagement, as people shared experiences and discussed ways to ensure that local authority was exercised fairly and transparently. My stand had inspired awareness, not through confrontation alone, but through demonstrating that knowledge, preparation, and steadfastness could turn the tide in what seemed like an impossible situation. On a personal level, the ordeal had profound effects. Stress and anxiety had been constant companions, but a newfound clarity about priorities, boundaries, and resilience tempered them. I had confronted not only external threats, but internal doubts, the fear that compliance might be easier, the uncertainty of escalation, and the weight of responsibility for protecting the farm and family. Emerging from the conflict with integrity intact and the property secure reinforced a sense of empowerment that transcended the immediate dispute. I had faced intimidation, harassment, and a seemingly endless barrage of petty rules, and emerged, not only unbroken but more decisive, wiser, and more determined. The resolution also highlighted the importance of documentation and strategy in conflicts that seem personal but are, at their core, legal and systemic. By keeping meticulous records, maintaining clear communication, and involving authorities when necessary, the power dynamic shifted decisively. What had begun as harassment transformed into accountability, demonstrating that preparedness and calm resolve could diffuse attempts at manipulation and coercion. Every fine, every letter, and every visit that had once threatened to intimidate now served as a testament to the homeowner's diligence, foresight, and unyielding commitment to justice. Financially, the immediate threats were neutralized. The HOA's fines were rendered unenforceable in light of proper documentation and legal guidance, and there was no lien or claim against the property. This outcome was not simply a relief, it was vindication. Months of stress and meticulous record-keeping had paid off, proving that standing firm in the face of unjust authority could prevent not only physical or emotional harm, but also financial exploitation. The farm remained secure, the family's legacy intact, and the message to potential aggressors was unmistakable. Overreach would not be tolerated. Emotionally, the experience created a deeper connection to the property and the routines that had once seemed mundane. Every fence post, every pasture, every familiar path through the fields now carried the weight of endurance, vigilance, and triumph. I recognized, in a way I hadn't before, that land is more than just property. It is memory, heritage, and identity. Protecting it requires more than maintenance. It requires courage, awareness, and, when necessary, decisive action. Rex's presence continued to be both practical and symbolic. He had defended the farm and family when it mattered most. Still, his loyalty and readiness also served as a reminder that preparation and partnership could overcome fear and uncertainty. The bond between homeowner and companion had been tested under extreme circumstances, and the shared experience of vigilance, confrontation, and resolution strengthened the unspoken trust that underpinned daily life on the property. The HOA, reduced in influence and humbled by the confrontation, became cautious in its subsequent actions. Board members communicated less aggressively, issued fewer demands, and showed greater consideration for legal boundaries. While some rules remained, the approach shifted toward transparency and fairness rather than intimidation and arbitrary enforcement. This change, subtle yet significant, marked the lasting impact of a homeowner's unwavering stand. In the months that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, but the lessons endured. Conversations among neighbors emphasized fairness, awareness of rights, and the importance of documenting interactions with authority. People shared experiences, learned from each other's strategies, and developed a collective understanding that arbitrary power could and should be challenged. The farm became a quiet symbol of resilience, a testament to the ability to face intimidation with intelligence, patience, and courage. The personal transformation was profound. I approached daily tasks with renewed focus, mindful of the lessons learned, vigilance without paranoia, assertiveness without aggression, and preparation without obsession. The tension that had once dominated thoughts and routines was replaced by confidence and pride, a clear understanding that the integrity of one's home, family, and principles was worth any temporary discomfort or challenge. Reflecting on the ordeal, I recognized that the victory was not simply about fines avoided or authority resisted. It was about reclaiming a sense of agency, demonstrating that intimidation, harassment, or arbitrary control could be countered when approached with preparation, clarity, and unwavering commitment. The HOA's attempts at manipulation had failed, not because of luck, but because the response was deliberate, informed, and resolute. The ultimate takeaway was clear. Defending what is rightfully yours requires more than anger or reaction. It demands strategy, courage, and the willingness to stand firm even when the odds seem stacked. The farm, my family, and my sense of justice had been tested under pressure, and the outcome reaffirmed the principle that rights, property, and dignity are worth defending. Every letter, every visit, every fine had served to underscore that lesson, transforming an ordeal into a powerful affirmation of resilience. As life settled back into its rhythms, there remained an unspoken vigilance. The HOA neighbors and community had all witnessed the turning point, and the precedent was clear. Harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority would not prevail against preparation, persistence, and steadfast resolve. Yet the story also left a lingering question, one that resonated beyond the property lines. How many others would stand firm, and how many would allow fear to dictate compliance? In the quiet evenings, as the sun set over the fields and Rex rested, at my feet I found satisfaction not only in the outcome, but in the knowledge that every step taken had been deliberate, justified, and effective. The confrontation had ended, but the lessons endured. An indelible reminder that courage, preparation, and a refusal to yield to unjust pressure could protect what truly matters. The resolution was more than a legal victory. It was a reaffirmation of values, a restoration of peace, and a demonstration that integrity and persistence could overcome intimidation. The property, family, and sense of home remained intact, stronger than before, and the story of this conflict became a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unshakable commitment to defending what is rightfully yours. And as the night settled over the farm, a final thought lingered, influential and enduring. The battle may have ended, but the resolve, vigilance, and courage cultivated through it would remain forever, an unspoken promise that no threat, no intimidation, and no arbitrary authority could ever take away what had been fiercely defended.